Norwich, England, in the spring of 1144. The city was still wrapped in the lingering chill of winter. Rain-soaked stone streets, narrow and dark, echoed with the hurried footsteps of townspeople preparing for Holy Week. This was the most sacred time of the year, when the Christian community commemorated the death of Jesus Christ and awaited the resurrection. Church bells rang long and slow, as if reminding people of sin, redemption, and the fragile hope of a new beginning. But within that holy atmosphere, something happened, quietly and cruelly. In Thorpe Wood, on the northern edge of the city, the body of a child was discovered. Not a warrior fallen on a battlefield, not a thief punished for his crimes, but a boy, small and thin, still dressed in his everyday clothes. He lay there among dry branches and rotting leaves, as if the world had forgotten him. His name was William. He was 12 years old. No one knew how he had died. No one witnessed his final moments. No cries for help were heard. There was only the silence of the forest, and a shock that spread quickly through the city. The boy's body was not buried immediately with formal rites. There were no solemn prayers, no comforting embraces of farewell. At first, William's death resembled so many others in the Middle Ages. Poor, fragile, and easily forgotten. But then, questions began to surface. Who had done this? Why would a child die during Holy Week? And, most importantly, who would be held responsible? In a city divided by power, ethnicity, and belief, William's death was not merely a personal tragedy. It became a void into which fear crept. A space where rumors could grow. A space where people searched for someone to bear the blame for their own unease. The story of William of Norwich did not begin with truth, but with emotion. With the grief of a family. With the confusion of a community. And with a deeply human need, the need for an explanation, whether that explanation was true or not. From that moment on, the death of a single boy moved beyond Thorpe Wood. It entered history, and there, it was no longer just the death of William, but the beginning of a story that would haunt Europe for centuries. William was born in Norwich around the year 1132, into an ordinary working family. Neither wealthy nor powerful, and not one remembered by history. He was not raised to become a hero or a saint. William grew up like hundreds of other children in the city, among narrow alleys, gray stone walls, and the heavy rhythm of life in medieval England. William's childhood offered few choices. From a very young age, he was forced to leave behind childhood games and step into the world of adults. William was sent to apprentice in leatherworking and tanning, a job that was exhausting and filthy, yet essential to life at that time. Day after day, he handled raw hides, endured the sharp stench, and worked alongside the calloused hands of craftsmen. It was not work meant for a 12-year-old child, but in 12th century Norwich, it was considered normal. William had a mother, relatives, and people who cared about him. His mother was not a woman of status, only a poor woman trying to raise her child in a harsh society. She sent William to work not out of ambition, but out of survival. Every coin William earned carried a real and immediate meaning. His work took William throughout the city. He entered crowded marketplaces, workshops, and even the homes of the Jewish community living near Norwich Castle. To William, these were not religious or ethnic boundaries. They were simply places where work could be found. He carried no fear and no hatred. He was just a child doing what adults asked of him. There is no evidence that William was especially devout. There are no signs that he lived an unusually holy life. He was not known for prayers, nor for acts of heroism. William was simply a boy, learning how to survive in a world that left little room for innocence. That is what makes William's story all the more heartbreaking. He did not choose to become a symbol. He did not choose to stand at the center of a historical tragedy. He only chose to live one more day, to do one more job, and to bring home one more coin for his family. When we look back at William of Norwich, what matters most is not how he died, but how he lived. A short life, simple and deeply human. And it was that very ordinariness that turned William's death into a deep wound in the memory of an entire age. Holy Week of the year 1144 arrived in Norwich under a heavy and solemn atmosphere. The city slowed its ordinary rhythm of life. People walked more quietly. Faces were lowered. Prayers were repeated again and again inside cold stone churches. This was a time when people were taught to reflect on sin, on sacrifice, on death, and on redemption. During those days, William still had to work. He was not granted a holiday like those with better means. Work did not wait for devotion. Hides still needed to be tanned. Goods still had to be delivered. The lives of the poor did not stop simply because the church calendar demanded it. At the beginning of Holy Week, a man appeared at the door of William's home. He spoke politely, introduced himself as someone working for the church, and said there was a simple job for the boy in a kitchen. It sounded harmless enough. 3 shillings were paid in advance. For a poor family, it was not a small sum. William's mother hesitated. But in the end, she agreed. Not out of greed, but out of trust. Who would suspect work connected to the church during days as sacred as these? William was called. He stood up. He left the familiar house, carrying a very childlike belief that he would soon return. Along the way, William stopped to visit a relative. Someone saw him. Someone remembered that he seemed normal, not worried, not afraid. Those were the last images of William while he was still alive. After that day, he disappeared. There were no cries for help, no signs of struggle. No one came running with terrible news. Only a growing emptiness inside his mother's small home. A bed left unused. A morning without the sound of familiar footsteps. In the Middle Ages, children going missing was not unheard of. But for a mother, every passing hour felt like a knife cutting deeper into the heart. She waited. She asked. She hoped. Then, she began to fear. Holy Week continued to move forward. The city turned its gaze toward Easter, while William's family remained trapped in a wordless waiting. And none of them knew that, at the very moment people were praying for eternal life, the life of a child had quietly come to an end somewhere beyond the sight of everyone. Thorpe Wood lay on the northern edge of Norwich, where the city's stone roads gradually dissolved into the shadows of trees and damp earth. It was not a place people went to pray or to reflect. It was a desolate place, one that people avoided, especially during Holy Week, when fear and superstition lingered heavily in the minds of medieval people. On Holy Saturday of the year 1144, something unusual shattered the forest's silence. A nun passing by noticed a strange shape among the bare branches. At first, no one dared to approach. In a world where death was always tied to ominous signs, the body of a child lying in the woods was not only a heartbreaking sight, but a terrifying one. Eventually, a forester named Henry de Sproston entered the forest. He found William's body. The boy was still fully clothed, his shoes still on, his face pale and silent, as if sleep had simply lasted too long. There were no cries, no lamentations. Only the stunned stillness of those who witnessed it. William's body was not brought back to the city immediately. There was no physician. There was no examination. His death, at least at that moment, was not considered an event that required investigation. It was decided that he would be buried right where he was found, on unconsecrated ground, as was commonly done with deaths of unknown cause. In the days that followed, the news spread throughout Norwich. People gathered at Thorpe Wood. They stood and looked upon the body of a child many of them had seen on the streets before. An apprentice, a child of the city. William was recognized, named, and confirmed as real. His family eventually arrived. The pain was no longer a vague fear, but a stark reality. William was dead. Not at home, not in the arms of loved ones, but in the forest, alone, with no one knowing what had happened. Later, his body was buried again with prayers for his soul. But everything happened quickly, imperfectly, as if the city wanted to close the matter as soon as possible. No difficult questions were asked. No one searched for a culprit. William's death, like so many others of that era, stood on the edge of being forgotten. Yet it was precisely that haste and silence that created a void. And within that void, fear began to whisper. Suspicion began to take root. Thorpewood did not merely hold the body of a child. It held an unanswered question, one that was about to change the fate of an entire community. Norwich, in the middle of the 12th century, was not a unified community. Beneath the surface of religious rituals and everyday routines, the city was divided by power, language, and origin. Native Anglo-Saxons lived alongside the Norman ruling class, people who had come from across the sea and now controlled land, law, and force. Between them stood the Jewish community, French-speaking, living in close quarters near the castle, placed under the direct protection of royal authority. That protection was both a shield and a curse. It made the Jewish population distinct, visible, and in the eyes of many struggling poor, easy to resent. When life became unstable, when taxes grew heavier, when war and famine always seemed close at hand, that difference became a target for buried anger. William's death came at exactly that moment. A child dying during Holy Week was not merely a tragedy, but a sacred offense in the medieval Christian imagination. People needed an explanation. And when evidence was lacking, they turned to emotion. They turned to what felt most familiar to their fear. William's family, along with some local clergy, began to direct their gaze toward the Jewish community. Not because they possessed clear proof, but because the Jews were different, outside the shared faith, and therefore the easiest to suspect when something terrible occurred. They demanded justice from the ecclesiastical court. They wanted a trial. They wanted someone to pay for William's death. But the power structures of the time did not operate on emotion. The Jewish community did not fall under the authority of church courts, because they were not Christian. They were considered the king's property, under the protection of the Norman sheriff. The sheriff brought the Jewish population into Norwich Castle to shield them from the fury of the crowd. To many townspeople, this act did not look like justice, but like protection for the suspected. The sense of injustice grew stronger. Suspicions sank deeper. There was no trial. There was no verdict. Only a long, stretching silence. And within that silence, accusations began to form on their own. They required no evidence. They only needed repetition. In taverns, on street corners, in whispered conversations after prayer, people began to say that William's death was not accidental, that it carried religious meaning, that someone had done this deliberately. The community of Norwich entered a dangerous phase. When the grief of one family blended with the divisions of an entire city, reason slowly gave way to fear, and when fear finds something to cling to, truth becomes more fragile than ever. The death of William, once a personal tragedy, was gradually turning into a collective accusation, and Norwich, in that moment, was no longer just a grieving city. It became the ground where a dark story was about to be born. About 6 years after William's death, when the initial grief had settled and the city of Norwich seemed to have learned how to live with that memory, a new figure entered the story. He was not a witness. He had not been present during Holy Week of the year 1144. He had not seen William for the last time. He had not stood in Thorpewood when the body was discovered. Yet it was this man who would decide how history would remember the boy. His name was Thomas of Monmouth. Thomas was a Benedictine monk who came to Norwich to serve at the cathedral priory. He was educated, able to write, able to tell stories, and more importantly, he knew how to make people believe. In an age when the written word was power, Thomas held a weapon, stronger than any sword. He began gathering stories surrounding William's death. But this was not an investigation in the modern sense. Thomas did not compare evidence. He did not test the reliability of testimony. He listened to what people said, then selected, arranged, and connected those accounts into a narrative shaped by deep religious meaning. In his work titled The Life and Miracles of William of Norwich, Thomas did more than recount the death of a child. He transformed it into a narrative of martyrdom. William was no longer an apprentice tanner. He became a reflection of Jesus Christ himself, betrayed, tortured, and killed at the most sacred moment of the year. Details began to appear, little by little. A maid claimed she had seen the boy through a crack in a door. A man confessed on his deathbed that he had once seen a body being carried through the woods. And then there was Theobald, a Jewish convert, who asserted that in ancient tradition, Jews were required to sacrifice a Christian each year. None of these people spoke at the time of William's death. Their stories surfaced only many years later, after Thomas had already begun writing his account. But for Thomas, that was not a problem. In the medieval culture of saintly biography, historical truth mattered less than sacred meaning. The more closely a story resembled the familiar pattern of martyrdom, the more readily it was accepted. Thomas believed, or convinced himself to believe, that William was a saint. And when someone believes absolutely in the story they are telling, their voice becomes persuasive. Thomas did not write like a cold-hearted deceiver. He wrote like a man who genuinely believed he was serving the truth of God. Yet it was precisely that belief that made the story dangerous. Because when a story is written to prove holiness, every detail that does not fit is discarded. Every gap is filled with assumption, and every doubt is explained away as a test of faith. From that point on, William's death was no longer an unsolved case. It became a complete story, with villains, a victim, and sacred meaning. And Thomas of Monmouth, with his pen, transformed a vague tragedy into a truth that was told, believed, and passed down through generations. He did not merely write about William. He created William. And in doing so, he created a story that would grow far beyond his own control. After Thomas of Monmouth's account was written, William's death entered a new phase. It no longer rested quietly in the private grief of a single family, or in the silence of Thorpe Wood. It was brought into the most sacred space of the city. From that moment on, William was not merely remembered, he was constructed. William's body was moved, first, from its makeshift burial site in the forest, then into the monastery graveyard. Not long after, his remains were placed in increasingly prominent locations inside Norwich Cathedral. Each relocation carried a message. William was being elevated, not through legal evidence, but through ritual. Stories of light surrounding his remains began to circulate. People said that when they prayed at William's grave, illnesses eased, pain softened, hope was rekindled. In a society that lived constantly in the shadow of disease, poverty, and death, miracles did not need to be proven. They only needed to be believed. Yet even within the monastery, not everyone agreed. Some monks opposed the veneration of William. They questioned the boy's life of faith. They doubted the authenticity of the martyrdom narrative. They worried that this cult was moving too fast, too far, and too conveniently. Those concerns were not strong enough to stop the machine that had already begun to move. Because a new saint brought many things: faith for the people, prestige for the church, and undeniably, financial gain from pilgrims who came seeking miracles. The Bishop of Norwich supported the building of a cult around William. Thomas continued recording miracles. The stories were retold, repeated, refined with sacred language. William was described as wearing a crown of thorns, bearing marks of suffering, mirroring the familiar image of Jesus Christ in the Christian imagination. Step by step, William was separated from his real self. He was no longer the child who had worked in tanning workshops. He became a symbol convenient for faith, for power, and for the needs of the age. This construction did not happen overnight. It was the result of years of repetition, rituals, and stories told again and again in the same voice. And when a story is told long enough within a sacred space, it begins to replace memory. William of Norwich, once an unknown boy, became an unofficial saint, not because of what he had done in life, but because of what others needed him to represent after his death. The story of William of Norwich did not stop at the boundaries of that city. Once it was written down, preached from church pulpits, and passed from mouth to mouth among the people, it began a long and dangerous journey. From an unexplained death, it became a template for a new accusation, one that would be repeated again and again throughout European history. People began to believe that William's death was not an isolated case. If one child could be killed for ritual reasons, then other deaths could be explained in the same way. Each time a child disappeared, each time a body was found without clear answers, the old story was invoked once more. Jewish communities in other cities began to live in fear. They understood that truth was no longer the most important thing. What mattered was what the crowd needed in order to release its anger and explain its unease. A rumor, if repeated often enough, became a verdict. In the decades after William, similar accusations appeared in Gloucester, in Bury, in Lincoln. Other names were spoken. Other children were declared saints. And behind each story were shattered families, attacked communities, and people killed simply because they held a different faith. That dark legacy did not emerge overnight. It grew alongside the Crusades, alongside fear of the other, alongside the dangerous fusion of faith and violence. When a society comes to believe that evil can be identified by identity, then anyone who carries that identity becomes a target. William of Norwich became the first name in a long chain. He was not only stripped of his life, he was stripped of his right to rest. His death was used to justify the deaths of others. And within that legacy, the most heartbreaking truth is not only the number of people who died, it is the way a false story can be granted moral authority, turning fear into justice, and turning human beings into enemies of their fellow human beings. Many centuries after William's death, when religious emotion had receded and history began to be examined through scholarly methods, researchers returned to this story with a different question: not who was right or who was wrong, but what can truly be known. Modern historians are nearly unanimous on one fundamental point. William of Norwich was a real child. He died a violent death. His body was found in Thorpe Wood. That is where the evidence ends. Every other detail, from motive to perpetrator to ritual meaning, cannot be verified by the standards of historical research. When scholars reread the writings of Thomas of Monmouth, they recognize something crucial. This was not an investigative record. It was a work of religious literature, written according to the saintly biography models popular in the 12th century. The emotionally charged details, the testimonies that appeared years later, the miracles that were recorded, all served the purpose of constructing meaning, not of discovering truth. Some historians have proposed alternative explanations. William may have been the victim of a personal act of violence. It may have been an accident that was concealed. The person responsible may never have been identified. What these hypotheses share is caution. None of them claim what the evidence does not allow. The modern academic perspective does not seek to strip away the grief of William's family. On the contrary, it restores to him something that was taken away long ago: the right to be seen as a human being, not a symbol, a child who died violently, not a tool used to justify hatred. When the story is viewed through the lens of the present, what troubles us is not only William's death, but the way society chose to tell that death. And in that choice, history reveals a quiet yet enduring lesson about humanity's responsibility to the truth. William of Norwich entered history not because of what he did, but because of what others said about him. A child who died in the woods, who should have been nothing more than a private tragedy for a poor family, was pulled out of the intimacy of grief and turned into a story that served fear, power, and the beliefs of the crowd. When a story is told long enough, it no longer needs truth in order to survive. It sustains itself on emotion, on outrage, on the deeply human need to have someone to blame when the world becomes confusing and unjust. And from that moment on, the story begins to kill, not with knives or swords, but with words. William was no longer William. He became a symbol used to legitimize hatred, to justify violence, to force other people, other families, to pay the price for something that was never proven. Yet if we pause for a moment and look more closely at this story, we see something very simple. Beneath all the arguments, the accusations, and the centuries of misunderstanding, there remains only the image of a 12-year-old child who left home during Holy Week and never returned. History is often written by those who have a voice, But the responsibility of the present is to listen to the voices that were silenced. Not to erase the past, but to understand it. Not to condemn those who lived in fear, but to recognize the cost when that fear is transformed into truth. The story of William of Norwich reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not an unexplained death. It is a false explanation, believed for far too long. And when people stop asking questions, the very story they believe becomes history's quietest and most deadly killer.